Hi, my friends. It's Stephen Hovater. I'm the minister at the Church of Christ of Cedar Lane, just down the street, and I'm grateful to be able to participate with you guys in this digital summer series, which of course, makes me feel some regret because of the summer series that we had planned this summer, which we would be sharing with you all and the folks at Wilson Avenue this whole summer long, and we would be coming to the end of it here in the next week or two. But that wasn't what was meant to be, and instead we've all had to improvise and do some other things instead. But we look forward to being with you all soon, and we hope that next summer everything can be cleared up, and we hope we'll be able to gather in a more traditional way, or at least like we have over the last few years. We've really appreciated that here at Cedar Lane, and we really appreciate the relationship we have with the church there at Highland Hills. In the Gospel of John, John does something that the other writers maybe don't do quite as much. Maybe they all do a little bit, but John seems to delight at giving us snapshots of different characters that are sprinkled throughout the story and can be threaded together to show a journey of a character. And so you get some things like the story of Simon Peter that's sort of threaded throughout the story of the gospel, or you get a story of Didymus or Thomas, the twin, that follows him at different developments along the story. A couple of other disciples too. One of my favorite character journeys, though, is a surprising one because it's not one of Jesus's inner circle. It's not part of his inner band, but rather it's somebody that almost by definition is on the outside of his group from the very beginning. And really, truthfully, doesn't come until a later point in the story to offer a different kind of submission to Jesus, I guess we should say. And it's interesting because when you look at a character many times in the Gospels, you just get, of course, you have the disciples that are following him around, and you get the interactions that develop over time. But a lot of the interactions that come from other people are sort of snapshots, and we get them as they come, and they show they maybe have a question for Jesus, maybe they have hope in what he's going to say, or maybe they have antagonism towards him, and you get them for just a brief moment, and you perhaps see them respond to Jesus in some way, but there's very little arc of transformation, and that's really. I wish we had more stories of the kind of long arcs of transformation in the Gospels. We do get a few of those, and when they do, they shine like bright stars. Partly, I love those kinds of stories because they're very interesting from a literary standpoint, right? Like when I read a story and I want to think about what's happening in a novel or maybe a short story or some kind of piece of fiction. One of my favorite things to do is to trace what happens with the transformation of the main character. In some books, you can tell who the hero is. Maybe you're a little confused about who the hero is in the story. Well, start looking at who it is that's changing the most, or who it is that's undergoing some sort of transformation. And it gives you a little bit more insight into what the author is trying to say. Or if you go to a movie or you see a movie, like think about when you finish watching a movie, one of the interesting lenses that you can use to kind of really perceive what the story that the filmmakers are trying to tell is who's transforming and how do they transform? What does their transformation mean and indicate about their humanity? Like what does it show about who they are? On the flip side, one of the problems I think for us in our era is that a lot of our art, or a lot of our cultural art, is in the form of these like serial sitcoms, and they thrive on the principle that nobody changes, right? That if you watch an episode of, I don't know. I didn't even think about what show I'm thinking of here, but almost any kind of comedy, like take the New Girl or The Big Bang Theory or whatever, and you take an episode at the middle of season 1, you take an episode in the middle of season 4, and a lot of times those characters, they haven't really changed at all. That's what makes it funny. You kind of know the gags. You know how these characters respond to different things. I mean, The Simpsons was on for has spanned 3 decades of work, and Bart Simpson doesn't really ever change. Like, Homer's pretty much the same, at this point as he is, or in the early '90s, right? And we suffer for that a little bit, right? Because we need stories of transformation. We need to see how people change. We need to see the sorts of things that people go through as they go through the journey of life, as they mature or and get wiser, or maybe sometimes as they break down and devolve and become more foolish. We need to see stories of transformation. I want to come back to that in a little bit, but before we do, I want us to dive into this story in the Gospel of John, which is a story of pretty incredible transformation. It's the story of Nicodemus. And it resonates well with your guys' theme about what it means for light to emerge out of darkness, because Nicodemus comes to Jesus first. In John chapter 3, he comes under the cover of night. As John tells the story, it says, "There was a Pharisee named Nicodemus, a leader of the Jews, and he came to Jesus by night and said to him," and it goes on to begin to tell the questions that Nicodemus has. And you got to say, as you read that story, it starts off feeling like Nicodemus is asking some very sincere questions to Jesus. He even begins by saying, "Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher who has come from God." And for readers of the Gospel of John, we know that phrase, "came from God," actually turns out to be super important over the course of the story. John comes back to that theme of Jesus' sentness, that he's the one who came from heaven or came from above, that he's the one that has come from God, and that's how he knows who God is. Like, Jesus was with God in the beginning, and now he's come into earth. And that Nicodemus recognizes it and begins his conversation with Jesus by saying, "Hey, we recognize that you're from God." Like, that's a pretty good sign for Nicodemus. And yet it also says something, not just the words that he's saying, right? Like, we don't understand people just by what they say. We also pay attention to what they do. Why is this guy who has been described as a Pharisee, a leader of the Jews, he's later hanging out with the crowd that's called the Pharisees and the chief priests, or the ones in authority, why is he making a house call to someone that is developing a reputation as a rabbi at night? Well, it seems like it's because he wants to avoid the notoriety and the stigma that might come by attaching himself to Jesus. I mean, John kind of deals with this kind of question a lot, whether it's, the woman who comes to the well at a time of the day, which would have been unusual for people to come, and thus kind of avoids the crowd that would stigmatize her, or whether it's the story of the blind man in John chapter 9, who is threatened with being kicked out of the synagogue. In other words, being kicked out of his community and losing the sort of community relationships that he has. Or whether we're thinking about the conversations that Jesus has with his disciples as other people are kind of being turned off from him and leaving, and he says, "What are you guys going to do? Are you going to leave too?" And Peter responds, or the disciples rather respond there and say, "Master, where can we go? We think you've got the words of life. I mean, we can't go to anybody else, right?" There's this kind of question all through, especially the early part of the Gospel of John. It's, are people going to be willing to attach themselves to Jesus, or are they going to be turned off? Maybe because of the things that Jesus says that are hard for them to hear, or maybe because of the reputation that Jesus is developing with the elite part of society. maybe because of the people that might disown them or might insult them or might put them out because they follow him. John says because of all those reasons, there are people that are going to choose, even though they might understand that Jesus is something special, that they're going to choose to kind of walk away from him. And Jesus is always pushing against that. Always kind of giving people a look and saying, are you willing to push through all of those things and get over those obstacles and come to me? Or are you going to walk away because it's just too hard for you? Nicodemus comes in the night. And this conversation in John chapter 3, of course, is very famous, and it has some important concepts that are beloved by the church, that are loved by many, right? Like it has this opening conversation about being born again, and that language, of course, is really important to us as we think about what it means to become the people of God and to take on Jesus' story as our own. It has all these notes and undertones about baptism in it, right? About being born of water and the Spirit. And so there's that important section there. And of course, we look a little bit further and we get the most famous verse in the New Testament, perhaps, right? That for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish but have eternal life. So Jesus has something to say about what it means to become his follower, but he also has something to say about his own mission and his own vocation as the sent one of God, that he is bringing people to life. Like this conversation with Nicodemus is full of like some really insightful stuff. And I would love to mine it with you and to think through all the different layers of meaning that come in this conversation. But we're going to have to save that for another day. Because I want us to focus on what comes after that section, that really famous verse in verse 16, and the verse that follows it, which is fairly significant too, where it says, "Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him." And these are very important concepts in our faith, the way that we come to salvation, that God's desire is for us to be saved, that we come and by believing in Jesus, we can be rescued from the destruction that is in front of us. But I want us to pick up with what happens just after that, because it is a little bit of a gut punch to Nicodemus. And if we've been following along, we know that this guy has come in the middle of the night, that he's avoiding being seen by others, perhaps, that he may be unwilling to lose his reputation because of Jesus or stake something on Jesus. These verses kind of ring with something personal. It says, and this is verse 19, "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God." Now that is a really significant passage, and it says something to all of us. It's easily applicable because we all go through moments in our lives where we act in such a way that we would become embarrassed if everybody else knew it, right? I mean, Jesus says something here that's it's really easy to identify with all of us, right? There are times when I would be embarrassed if there was a video camera on me and what I had done was, being proclaimed to the whole world. But I want you to hear that passage again and hear it with the ears of Nicodemus, not just yourself. Okay, it's good to be able to read ourselves, hear passages in light of what they say to us personally. But I want you to pull back and hear what it says again to Nicodemus, right? And it says, for all who do evil hate the light, right? It says people loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. And what does that say to this person who has come to Jesus to ask his questions under the cover of darkness? What does it say to the man who has come perhaps of fear of losing some reputation because of Jesus? What does it say that he comes and sneaks? He comes under the cloak of the night. And Jesus says, you know, Nicodemus, part of the big problem of the world, the big picture problem, is that people love darkness. People love darkness instead of light because they love being able to hide. And they love being able to keep from being seen because they know if they're really seen, that there's something evil about them. Wow. Wow, right? Like, can you imagine what that meant for Nicodemus? So he's heard some stuff, right? And so this guy that comes and starts by saying, hey, I know that you're a teacher. I know that you're a teacher who was sent from God because I see the stuff that you're doing. I see the miracles that you're at work doing in the world, right? No one can do these signs that you do apart from the presence of God, Nicodemus said. So he comes assuring Jesus, hey, Jesus, I know that you're on the right side of this stuff, right? But, I've got some questions I want to ask. And Jesus asked some hard questions back to him, and Nicodemus is kind of muddling through this conversation. And then he gets to this part at the end, and he has to hear Jesus say, hey, Nicodemus, the real big issue with the world is people like being in the dark rather than being in the light. And what do you think that meant to Nicodemus when he went home? Imagine Nicodemus in the night on the way to Jesus, but I want you to imagine Nicodemus in the middle of the night on the way home, going through the empty streets, finding his way back home. Maybe asking himself, what is it with me? Why was I embarrassed to stand up for what I think about this guy? I can imagine Nicodemus just slowly making his way through the streets, slowly finding his way home, rolling into bed next to his sleeping wife, laying there for a minute with his eyes open, contemplating what Jesus had said, and wondering whether really he was a person of the light. Or maybe there was a part of him, just like Jesus was talking about, that was like a person who really, really loved darkness more than light. A few chapters later in John chapter 7, Jesus goes to a festival, the Festival of Booths, the Festival of Tabernacles. It's a really interesting, Thanksgiving sort of festival for there in Jerusalem. And Jesus there seems to have no problem opening up controversies. And he absolutely has this kind of prophetic moment in the middle of this festival, and where to the crowd, to the crowd that is gathered there in this pilgrimage festival, where people would come from the towns around and come to Jerusalem. Jesus stands up at one point and says, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture says, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." And the text says that he's talking about the Holy Spirit in this. And then there's this moment, right, where the crowds hear this and they're saying, he's a prophet. And some of them say he's a Messiah. And others say, man, the Messiah doesn't come from Galilee. That's not right. He's supposed to come from Bethlehem. And there's this unrest because of Jesus, right? And Jesus has been pushing buttons all the way through this chapter. Like he has this willingness to antagonize the powers that be. At this point in the story, though, the crowd, the Pharisees have already been tasked. They've already tasked some of the police with arresting Jesus because they've kind of had enough of him, right? But when he's teaching and there's kind of this mixed appraisal of him by the crowd. The police say, let's let this guy go. We probably don't want to cause too much trouble. And so they go back and they report to the chief priest and the Pharisees. And they say, why didn't you arrest him? You're supposed to arrest him. Where is Jesus? Why didn't you bring him back? And they say, and the police say, never has anyone spoken like this. And the Pharisees are like, are you kidding me? You too. They say, surely you haven't been deceived too, have you? Has any one of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in them? But this crowd who doesn't know the law, they're accursed. So they kind of have this confrontation with these typical police who are like, I don't know, this guy's got some good things to say, Never heard anybody talk like that. Wasn't comfortable arresting him, sir. And they react and they say, are you kidding me? You guys have fallen in with the same crowd, this uneducated crowd who doesn't know anything about what they're talking about. And here you guys are, allowing them to sway your minds, when all of us, the people who know better, understand that this Jesus is out of line. And it says this, and this is John chapter 7 and verse 50, Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus before, who had gone to him before, and who was one of them, asked, Our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out what they are doing, does it? It says, then they replied, surely you're not also from Galilee too, are you? Search and you'll see that no prophet is to arise from Galilee. So we don't have much of a debate here, right? Like Nicodemus poses the question and the rest of them say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. We already know he can't be the prophet because he comes from Galilee. He's not supposed to come from Galilee, right? And there's no retort. Nicodemus doesn't answer. He doesn't continue to push. But can't you see that we're a little bit further down the road than we were in John chapter 3. In John 3, Nicodemus has come in the middle of the night, doesn't want anybody to see that he's in this, that he's investigating, he's even curious about Jesus. And here in John 7, Nicodemus has decided to kind of put himself out. Let me at least ask a question about it. Now, he doesn't actually state something. He doesn't go so far as to say, hey, I think this guy's right, or I think this guy's innocent. And he certainly doesn't say anything as positive as he had told Jesus at the beginning of John 3, where he says, we know that you've come from God because nobody could do the signs that you do unless they came from God. He doesn't say anything like that at this point, okay? Rather, what he does instead is he just asks a question challenging the dominant assumptions of the people who are against Jesus, right? He just says, hey, maybe we're rushing to a conclusion here, right? Maybe we're jumping to conclusions, guys. At least let's slow down and see, maybe we should at least hear him out. What do you think, And they shut him down and the conversation's over, but at least he's floating it, right? At least he's thinking about it. The Gospel of John gives us one more episode in this story of transformation. Sort of tragically, it comes in John chapter 19 And it actually comes after the crucifixion. So after Jesus is killed by the authorities, there's a moment where a person named Joseph of Arimathea, it says he's a disciple of Jesus, and it actually says that Joseph is a disciple, but he's a secret one because he's afraid of the powerful, the Jews, the leaders of their community, right? And it says that he goes and he asked Pilate to allow him to take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission, and so he came and removed his body. And then it says this note, right? It's just a little bit. It says Nicodemus, who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. And they took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices and linen cloths according to the burial customs of the Jews. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified. In the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So this is the last part of the journey that John describes to us in the story of Nicodemus. And I wish it gave us a little more. But I got to tell you, what it does gives us says a lot. And it takes us, it even calls back in the verses here in John chapter 19, it even calls back and says, Nicodemus, and as it identifies, remember the first chapter, it identifies him as a leader, a Pharisee, and a leader of the Jews, right? But here it doesn't call him that. Instead, what it calls him is Nicodemus, the one who had come to him first at night. It takes us back to how Nicodemus approached Jesus at the beginning. Scared, afraid. The first journey to Jesus was that journey where Nicodemus comes in shadows, wondering if anybody is going to see him. This next journey is a little bit different. And just like we imagine Nicodemus walking through the streets in the middle of the night, I want you to see him now hurrying a little bit because he's trying to get something done before nightfall. This time he's trudging through the city, but not because he's trying to keep a secret. It's because he's bearing a burden. It says he takes with him 100 pounds of burial spices. When Nicodemus comes this time, he comes not in shame, not in fear, but he comes out of the darkness and into the light. He has no reason to hide from the truth of what he's decided now. This journey for Nicodemus, it's one that needs to be told. I'm so glad that the author of the fourth gospel included it in this story, because I think it shows us what it means to move from a place where we're not sure about what we're ready to give up for Jesus, to we're willing to go to the cross with him. Nicodemus is ready to go to the cross with Jesus. And at that point, when he goes and he's part of the burial party for Jesus, he aligns himself with the one whom, like he said in the beginning, he knew had come from God. I think we need to hear more stories like that. More stories where people move from the darkness into the light. More stories where people have transformations because of what they've heard from Jesus, what they've seen from Jesus, and where they're allowing Jesus to change who they are. Listen, here's where I want to end today. I began by saying I love that those times in the Gospels where these stories take place. I love when they show up in film, and I love when they show up in different parts of the Bible. But I also love when they show up in churches, when we get to hear each other tell stories of how Jesus brought us out of the darkness and showed us the light, showed us a way to live in the light. We need to hear more stories, and if that's true, my man, you gotta tell your story. My sister, we need to hear your story. We need to hear the stories of each other. We have a rich tradition of transformation stories. People like Thomas and people like Peter and people like Nicodemus and people like you. You have a story to tell. And maybe it's not a finished story. Hey, listen, I don't know that the story that we hear in John is finished in chapter 19. I don't think Jesus is done with Nicodemus yet. The crucified Lord who would come back in the resurrection, I bet that Jesus had something for Nicodemus too. Jesus may not be done with your story, and you don't have to wait until the story's done and finished before you can tell what Jesus is doing in your life. Maybe it starts with the story about your questions. Your questions for Jesus that you're not sure about. Maybe it starts with those places where you began to kind of ask questions because you see something important in Jesus. Maybe it's just those moments where you're figuring out what it means for you to make a journey to the cross. We don't have to wait until the story's over. But we need to hear each other's stories, even if their stories still being told, still being written. We need to hear what it looks like, to see what it looks like when Jesus works his transformation in us, his transformation in us. So church, let's find ways of doing that. Let's share those stories with each other. And may the God who is at work in all of our stories have glory for the transformation he's bringing us into as he calls us out of the darkness and into the light. Amen.